One morning, without warning, billions of people woke up on the ceiling. Welcome to What If Horizons, the only podcast where science, satire, and sheer absurdity take turns driving the clown car of imagination straight into existential panic. And today, we're floating headfirst into a cosmic catastrophe most of us haven't prepared for. Because how could we? This is what happens when gravity, the quiet tyrant that's kept us grounded, literally, since the Big Bang, simply gives up. No bang, no flicker of foreboding in the stars. Just a moment. You're sipping coffee, annoyed by your shoelace, wondering if pigeons secretly mock us. And then suddenly, your mug floats away. Your shoelaces, now meaningless, dangle midair. And the pigeon? It's gone, soaring majestically upwards into the void, finally achieving the smug escape it's always dreamed of. And so are you. Let's be honest, gravity doesn't get enough credit. It's the clingy friend we all take for granted. Keeps the oceans from floating off. Keeps your soup in the bowl. Keeps your skeleton comfortably in your pants. But strip it away, and suddenly, everything you thought was reliable becomes a hilarious, horrifying joke. Buildings? Useless. Beds? More like springboards to oblivion. Airplanes? Surprisingly not the safest option anymore. People react to chaos in different ways. Some scream. Some pray. Some immediately try to livestream their ascent with hashtags like #NoGravityChallenge. For the first few minutes, it's oddly beautiful. The world becomes a zero-gravity ballet. Dust rises in slow-motion clouds. Leaves drift like dream confetti. Grandmas float past balconies clutching plastic bags full of potatoes. And then reality sets in. Physics is no longer your friend. It's left the group chat. Everything not bolted, glued, or cursed into place is lifting. Cars, cats, conference room whiteboards with diagrams no one ever understood. You float too. Up, through the ceiling if you're lucky, through the roof if you're not. There are accountants drifting over cities in their ergonomic chairs, clutching spreadsheets they no longer understand. Children spinning in midair, giggling, until they realize gravity also kept their toys and their cereal on the floor. The moon doesn't mind. It's seen worse. But Earth? Earth is in a mild panic. Every satellite goes off course. Tides freak out. Birds, who've built their entire legacy on cheating gravity, are suddenly disoriented and offended. We worked for this. A sparrow might have squawked, had it not been spiraling into the stratosphere beside a yoga mat and 3 disappointed ducks. Governments are, of course, useless. Emergency protocols for earthquakes? Sure. For nuclear meltdowns? Got him. For gravity deciding it's taking a permanent vacation to wherever dark matter hangs out? Not so much. The President of the United States is last seen floating across the rose garden in his socks, while aides desperately try to staple him to the Resolute desk. Meanwhile, influencers pivot instantly. Floating yoga becomes a thing. Microgravity skincare explodes. One TikToker invents aerial whisper cooking and gains 7 million followers in an hour by preparing lasagna while orbiting a chandelier. But even those who enjoy the chaos start to wonder, how long can this last? Are we just drifting forever now? Physics teachers, finally in the spotlight, try to explain things. Some suggest that maybe we've entered a localized pocket of altered space-time. Others propose that the Higgs field sneezed. A few blame the Large Hadron Collider. One bold man in a lab coat blames a butterfly in Bolivia. Nobody really knows. Religious leaders weigh in too. A floating monk declares, "This is enlightenment, just more literal than expected." Meanwhile, a televangelist in Texas announces the rapture has begun, only to be last seen clutching a satellite dish while ascending past a Taco Bell. But deeper questions loom. What happens to the atmosphere? Can we still breathe if the air itself starts drifting off the planet like an invisible soup escaping its pot? Will Earth's core, no longer pulled inward, begin to crumble like a badly baked souffle? For now, people cling to whatever they can. Furniture, fences, each other. There are ropes everywhere, hastily tied across streets like desperate urban spiderwebs. Some cities enforce anchor zones, areas filled with weighted suits and duct tape workshops. Others embrace the chaos, forming free-float communes, where you can only enter if you've completely given up. In the chaos, love still finds a way. A wedding is held midair between 2 astronauts who weren't even dating until today. Their rings float beside them, waiting to be caught. A couple shares a kiss upside down, suspended between floor and ceiling by bed sheets and hope. But under all the drifting bodies, misplaced shoes, and ceiling fans now doing real damage, one truth emerges. Gravity was never just a force. It was an anchor to everything we called normal. And now, normal is in orbit. By hour 2, Earth resembled a snow globe that someone had angrily shaken and then walked away from. Except instead of glitter, it was cows, sports cars, baguettes, and at least 3 confused marching bands slowly rotating above their hometowns. Somewhere over Paris, an entire wedding buffet drifted into the upper atmosphere, leaving behind only a half-eaten quiche and one very determined raccoon. For the average human being, this new reality came with immediate logistical challenges. First, you had to locate a surface that wasn't floating or about to detach. Then you had to cling to it using whatever was at hand: curtains, extension cords, your least favorite cousin. People became impromptu spider people, roping themselves to desks, doorknobs, and any object that still had the decency to stay where it belonged. Toilet use became a matter of precision timing and core strength. Hygiene routines adapted fast. Showers were now wild orbital adventures. Toothpaste had to be squeezed in slow motion to avoid accidental pepper spraying the ceiling. And don't even ask about shaving. Razors are not meant to float freely during face proximity. Of course, someone tried to monetize the chaos. Within 6 hours, a startup called NoFlow began selling gravity simulation kits, really just weighted vests and bungee cords with an app that plays ambient gravity noises. Their motto? We bring you down. Influencers wore them with pride while floating above abandoned malls, sipping carbonated drinks through curly straws and commenting on the aesthetic of chaos. TikTok was flooded with content tagged #ungrounded, including a man bench pressing his cat midair and a woman performing interpretive dance with a toaster. Meanwhile, a black market economy sprang up around mass objects. Anything still anchored to the earth became valuable: manhole covers, safes, bowling balls. Children traded bricks like currency. Entire neighborhoods fortified themselves with concrete statues, water towers, and whatever they could strap down with extension cords and hope. The phrase, "weight is power," took on a terrifying new meaning. Science, naturally, had things to say. Astrophysicists were losing their minds, some out of excitement, others because their labs had physically floated into the Pacific. A collective of European scientists announced, "We believe Earth has temporarily slipped out of its gravitational field like a banana out of its peel." No one was reassured by this. NASA, attempting to maintain calm, tweeted, "Everything is fine," followed by 37 crying emojis and a selfie of a floating vending machine crushing a desk. In Australia, people floated upside down, which really just confirmed to the rest of the world that Aussies were unfazed by anything. "Mate," one man said while casually playing chess in midair, "we've been training for this since the toilets flushed backwards." Religious interpretations diversified. A Zen group declared, "This is the final release from worldly attachments." Meanwhile, a megachurch in Florida insisted that anyone not floating must be secretly sinful and were promptly launched via trampoline to reach salvation altitude. A cult in Arizona renamed themselves the Floaters of Eternal Ascent and began worshiping a giant helium balloon shaped like Elon Musk's head. Animals, too, adapted, some better than humans. House cats thrived. Freed from gravity's tyranny, they floated smugly through living rooms, knocking objects into the void with renewed purpose. Dogs, confused but loyal, chased their humans through the air. Squirrels treated power lines like roller coasters. And bees? Bees disappeared, just vanished, probably unionized and took off. We wish them well. Yet amid the chaos, strange beauty emerged. Sky traffic became a thing. Whole families floated together in tethered bunches like awkward human helium balloons, watching the earth turn below. Children chased bubbles of water, laughing. Old lovers reunited midair after bumping into each other above a gas station. Artists began sculpting clouds into temporary statues. Musicians discovered that violins sound hauntingly beautiful when played in zero gravity. And in the middle of it all, a single pizza delivery guy managed to fulfill his order. Taped to his moped, wearing 2 helmets, he flew through a cityscape in free fall, delivering a large pepperoni to a birthday party that had relocated to a rooftop. He was never seen again. Legend says he's still floating, eternally 5 minutes away. But cracks in the joy started showing. Hospitals struggled. Supply chains dissolved. Satellites drifted. And people began to ask, is this forever? Can we live like this? Will trees still grow? Will oceans stay put? Will Earth remain a planet? Or will it crumble into a sad, floating asteroid field with tax records and yoga mats? And through it all, one fear loomed. If gravity can disappear just like that, what else can? By the third hour, yes, only the third, the world had become an accidental space station. Cities dangled in layers. Streets floated above rooftops. Cars hovered at strange angles like frozen dancers mid-pirouette. And public parks now resembled poorly choreographed low-budget sci-fi sets, with dogs chasing frisbees that would never land. Gravity was gone, and nobody could agree if this was a curse, a glitch, or just Tuesday in an especially ambitious simulation. Enter the inventors. The collapse of physics birthed a new golden age of chaotic engineering. Without the burden of weight, anyone with duct tape, a portable fan, and questionable decision-making was now technically an aerospace engineer. One man from Nebraska strapped 8 vacuum cleaners to a lazy-boy recliner and called it the Chairship Enterprise. He got as far as Cleveland before drifting into restricted airspace and being abducted by a confused weather balloon. Another woman fashioned a bicycle-powered rotating tether system to simulate artificial gravity. It worked perfectly, as long as she pedaled continuously and didn't mind vomiting every 7 minutes. She later sold the design as a therapeutic meditation device on Etsy. Governments, predictably, attempted control. The United Nations declared Global Emergency Stabilization Protocol 9, which sounded impressive but turned out to be just a PDF titled, "Please stay calm and tie yourself down." World leaders floated awkwardly in emergency chambers, tethered to chairs by extension cords, giving addresses with their hair waving dramatically and their dignity slowly detaching. Meanwhile, the laws of motion became an everyday nuisance. You couldn't move without bouncing off something. Arguments escalated quickly when both parties began to drift away mid-sentence. Even basic handshakes became long, delicate dances as people bobbed toward one another like confused jellyfish negotiating a business deal. There were injuries, of course, not from falling. Nobody fell anymore, but from collisions. High-speed banana peels, rogue ceiling fans, unsecured ladders spinning like death pinwheels. Insurance companies gave up entirely and rebranded as motivational services. We can't help you, but we believe in you. Commerce shifted. Grocery stores were now jungles of tethered produce. Cans floated like aggressive planets. Bread loaves were elusive prey. Shoppers wore weighted belts and used pool nets to capture items midair. Self-checkout became impossible. No one could scan floating barcode stickers. In protest, one man built a small anti-gravity farmer's market using magnetized vegetables. It attracted pigeons and lawsuits. In education, students discovered that homework, when not physically attached to anything, could always be lost to the atmosphere. Teachers retaliated by assigning floating oral exams. Cheating was still possible, but it required synchronized swimming and whispering through snorkel tubes. But not all was nonsense. In the absence of gravity, humanity discovered a strange and reluctant cooperation. Tethered communities began to form. Clusters of people who shared tools, rotated anchor duty, and passed the time floating around communal tether hubs like space-age laundromats. Neighbors who previously never spoke were now entangled, literally, in one another's lives, held together by repurposed garden hoses and emotional exhaustion. Someone invented a slow-rotating gravity drum, basically a giant hamster wheel suspended in the air that, when spun fast enough, created enough centrifugal force to simulate weight. It was immediately colonized by CrossFit influencers and spiritual retreat organizers. They called it the Circle of Alignment. Entry required 2 protein bars and a vow of silence. A few brave thinkers began wondering, what if this wasn't temporary? What if this was evolution? Without gravity, maybe this was a chance to reshape civilization. No more skyscrapers. No more walls. Homes built in 3 dimensions. Layers of floating spheres connected by tunnels of air and personality. A world where cities orbited ideas instead of highways. Of course, not everyone agreed. Panic still buzzed beneath the surface. Airplanes, no longer restricted by lift or drag, became dangerous drifting coffins. Trains floated off tracks like forgotten toys. Nuclear plants activated emergency ballast protocols, which mostly involved throwing heavy objects at reactors and hoping for the best. And what about space? Astronomers began to realize something even more disturbing. Gravity wasn't just gone here, it was missing everywhere. Planets were subtly shifting. Moons veered. The solar system was unwinding. In response, some scientists retreated into silence. Others doubled down on research. One man insisted he could fix gravity with jazz music and a tuning fork. Another said we were all simulations anyway, and asked if anyone had tried unplugging reality and plugging it back in. Still, amid the cosmic unraveling, humans kept going. They danced in the sky. They wrote floating poems in the air using neon markers and umbrellas. They played chess across dimensions, tethering the board to their ankles. They told bedtime stories to their children while spinning gently like leaves in an invisible wind. Because even without gravity, one force remained: the weird, irrational, stubborn drive to laugh in the face of absurdity and keep floating forward. By day 2, though the concept of days had grown fuzzy in a world where sundials were now just floating paperweights, humanity had officially entered the age of airborne improvisation. What began as scattered floating clumps of panic slowly congealed into something dangerously close to society. Gravity was still gone. Permanently, it seemed. No scientist, philosopher, or TikTok star had figured out why, though plenty had blamed the usual suspects: CERN, Elon Musk, 5G, Mercury in retrograde, and one particularly suspicious goat on a mountaintop in Peru. But the why no longer mattered. What mattered now was surviving without the one force that kept soup in the bowl and people off the ceiling. Enter the floating city-states. It began as a joke. A group of teenagers in Brooklyn tied their apartment furniture together into a massive floating raft and named it New Yabit. Within hours, other clusters followed. Skyberia, a repurposed shopping mall drifting over Eastern Europe. The Floatocracy, where decisions were made via democratic balloon popping. And Upminster, a proud British colony consisting entirely of retirees in floating tea houses. These city-states were tethered together by cables, laundry lines, and the mutual agreement not to let go. Borders became fluid. Quite literally, a gust of wind could shift the entire geopolitical landscape by 40 miles. International diplomacy now involved shouting between tethered lawn chairs and offering gifts of canned peaches as tribute. But of course, where there's community, there's conflict. Some floated for freedom. Others floated for control. One particularly aggressive group, the Gravitalians, began demanding gravity's return through increasingly dramatic means. Chanting, protest floating, and eventually forming a chain of synchronized skydivers who hurled weighted toasters earthward in ritual sacrifice. Another cult, calling themselves the Downers, insisted that gravity was a moral test from the universe. They preached that weightlessness was punishment for our collective hubris, specifically TikTok dance trends and the invention of pineapple pizza. Their leader, Brother Craig, floated constantly in the lotus position while muttering cryptic slogans like, "The massless shall inherit the wind." In response, more secular minds got practical. Engineers built sky stations powered by massive fans pointing downward. Farmers, desperate to grow crops, created vertical greenhouses tethered to the tops of abandoned skyscrapers. The tomato harvest floated. The cows, not so much. Education systems adapted too. Students now attended classes in float pods, tethered learning bubbles that drifted lazily in educational zones. Exams were given on magnetic whiteboards, and cheating required the cooperation of at least 4 friends, 2 fishing poles, and a grappling hook. One enterprising student launched himself into another classroom mid-test and was later awarded an A for creativity. But while some flourished, others struggled. The elderly had a rough time. Many were found suspended in chandeliers, having tried to retrieve something from the top shelf and just kept going. Emergency services developed air patrol teams, first responders armed with duct tape, portable vacuums, and inflatable nets. Fire departments started carrying trampolines upward instead of ladders. Religion, never one to be left behind in times of cosmic confusion, adapted rapidly. A new branch of Christianity emerged, called Ascensionism, claiming the rapture had simply updated its software and now included all denominations. Baptisms were performed midair using floating spheres of holy water. Hymns were sung in slow motion as choirs drifted between pews that had long since broken free from gravity's shackles. Meanwhile, a surprising development occurred in the arts. With no gravity, expression exploded, literally and figuratively. Dancers choreographed entire routines midair, using elastic tethers to spin through abandoned gymnasiums. Musicians floated in orchestral formations, each note played with a degree of weightless precision impossible in the old world. Painters threw pigments that hung in the air like colored mist, forming living murals that evolved with each breeze. And yet, even as creativity bloomed and society reshaped itself into floating constellations of stubborn hope, something deeper began to gnaw at the collective psyche. People missed the ground. They missed the sound of footsteps, the gentle creak of a floorboard, the satisfying thud of sitting in a chair that didn't drift. Children grew up not knowing the joy of falling down, only the frustration of never landing. Dreams of running turned to dreams of spinning in place, endlessly tethered, never rooted. The earth below, still there, still turning, had become distant, less like a home, more like a memory. A blue marble that once made sense, now unreachable, like an old photo of someone you used to love. And amid this melancholy, questions stirred again. Could gravity be rebuilt? Recreated? Could the laws of the universe be hacked, patched, rebooted? Some whispered about a secret experiment, a final attempt, a plan so foolish, so desperate, it could only be conceived by those with nothing left to lose and just enough science to be dangerous. The plan was codenamed Operation Dropkick, because of course it was. It started in a floating university somewhere over what used to be Geneva, now referred to as Airyland, by a band of rogue physicists, sleep-deprived engineers, and one retired ballet instructor who simply refused to keep pirouetting through life without resistance. They weren't government-sanctioned. They had no funding. They barely had snacks. But they had one goal: bring gravity back or die spinning. The logic was simple. Well, simple in the way a nuclear reactor built from chewing gum and nihilism is simple. Their theory: if gravity was a field, like magnetism or charisma, then maybe, just maybe, it could be stimulated, jump-started, kicked in the cosmic shins until it agreed to return to work. So, they built a device. It was part collider, part particle amplifier, and part blender. No one could explain how it worked, especially the person who designed it. Its core component was a homemade quantum thumper, a machine built to send ripples through space-time using controlled implosions of highly compressed irony. The irony was harvested from millions of internet comments and presidential tweets. The ballet instructor insisted the machine only be activated with a perfectly synchronized jump, a group leap of faith, preferably with dramatic lighting and music. The physicists agreed because, frankly, at that point, why not? Elsewhere, word of Operation Dropkick spread. The world watched, or floated, watching. Some were skeptical, others dared to hope. The downers declared it heresy and attempted to sabotage the launch by releasing a flock of gravity-purist pigeons trained to poop on the controls. They were intercepted mid-air by a rival cult called the Gravinites, who saw gravity's return as the fulfillment of prophecy and wore lead-lined robes to prove their devotion. The moment arrived. Broadcast live via hundreds of hovering drones, the world tuned in. Children tethered to rooftops clutched stuffed animals. Lovers held hands midair, afraid to blink. The elderly floated with dignity, wrapped in blankets and held in place by grandkids wielding extension cords. Even the cows seemed to moo more quietly. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. One of the physicists drifted slightly off course and had to be nudged back into place by the ballet instructor using a pool noodle. 7, 6. A man in the background proposed to his girlfriend using a ring suspended inside a snow globe. She said yes. The ring floated away. 5, 4. The quantum thumper hummed with unsettling glee, like a sentient dishwasher preparing for revolution. 3, 2, 1. They jumped. The synchronized leap was graceful, even poetic. For a moment, the world held its breath. Nothing happened. And then, absolutely everything happened. A sound rippled across the sky, low and strange, like the universe clearing its throat. The clouds shivered. Light bent. Birds screamed in languages we didn't know they spoke. Every object trembled, from orbiting microwaves to lonely flip-flops lost over the Atlantic. And then, impact. The world fell. Not all at once. Not violently. Just down. Objects gently reversed direction. People drifted back toward buildings, streets, oceans. A rain of forgotten furniture, lost socks, and baffled squirrels descended across the globe. There was joy. There was screaming. There were at least 6 spontaneous weddings, mostly between people who had crashed into each other mid-fall and decided to make it work. It was not perfect. Some things landed in unfortunate places. Cars on rooftops. Sandwiches in aquariums. One man in Finland fell directly into a wedding cake and was later canonized as a minor deity by the bakery. But overall, humanity landed. Gravity had returned. Mostly because, like a long-lost ex, it came back different. Lighter in some places, heavier in others. Paris now had a mild bounce. Tokyo tilted slightly west. The Grand Canyon echoed in Morse code if you yelled loud enough. But it was here. People could walk, sit, nap without floating away. Buildings hugged the earth. Trees sighed in relief. The ocean settled, awkward but calmer. And in this new world, a strange thing happened. People missed it. Not the panic, not the furniture spinning into space, but the freedom, the floating, the dreaminess of untethered life. For a brief, wild moment, humanity had touched the sky, not metaphorically, but literally. And now, with feet on the ground, they found themselves looking up, longing. So they adapted. Gravity wasn't a prison anymore. It was a choice, a setting. Some cities adopted free float hours, where gravity was locally disabled for dance parties, dream therapy, and competitive yoga. Others developed anti-gravity zones, pockets of regulated suspension for meditation, sports, or just naps in the clouds. And the legacy of Operation Dropkick lived on. The physicists returned to academia. The ballet instructor became a cult hero. The pigeons were given medals. And the world, though grounded, never quite returned to normal. Because once you've danced among the satellites and played poker with passing drones, it's hard to pretend the ground is all there is. And as the podcast floats to a gentle pause for now, one lesson remains clear. When gravity disappears, we may panic, we may fall apart, we may collide, but we also rise in ways we never imagined. Just when the world thought it had settled back into a rhythm, albeit one slightly more bouncy and unpredictably tilted, something curious began to happen. Gravity, having returned like a moody cat deciding it would once again grace your lap, didn't stick to the old script. It began acting, emotionally unstable. On Mondays, it was reliable. Shoes stayed on the floor, coffee stayed in mugs, and people commuted without needing ankle weights. Tuesdays, however, were different. A strange looseness crept in. Coins floated slightly. Office chairs slid toward windows with suspicious enthusiasm. By Wednesday, entire neighborhoods developed a mild lean, like a polite drunk trying not to admit they're drunk. People named this phenomenon wobble zones. Wobble zones were areas where gravity waxed and waned like a moody ex texting at 2 a.m., suddenly affectionate, then ghosting your soup bowl entirely. Cities started publishing daily gravitational stability forecasts, broadcast between the weather and traffic, complete with color-coded charts and ominous beeping. But not everyone hated it. Kids, of course, adapted fastest. In schools, recess evolved into gravity hour, where students floated for precisely 13 minutes while playing low-orbit dodgeball. PE classes began teaching reverse somersaults and how to cartwheel midair without crashing into gym rafters. The elderly? Not so thrilled. Grandparents, who had barely gotten used to video calls, now had to navigate fluctuating G-forces just to water a ficus. Many began wearing weighted house slippers and occasionally launched into ranting monologues about, back in my day, gravity had manners. Capitalism, with its usual grace and restraint, responded by marketing GravTech gadgets. There were personal gravity stabilizers, essentially glorified fanny packs with spinning lead orbs, and premium anti-drift harnesses that promised luxury levitation with 99% downward fidelity. One startup offered subscription-based gravity, delivered through satellite beacons, tiered by budget. The free version included ads during descent. Meanwhile, artists and philosophers seized the cultural moment. A new movement, gravism, emerged in which poets refused to write on paper, instead whispering their work into floating magnetic orbs suspended in midair. Museums installed anti-gravity wings, where viewers floated gently past kinetic sculptures and abstract paintings titled things like Tension in the Socks and My Mother, the Ceiling. Churches, too, adapted. Floating prayer sessions became popular, with congregants gently drifting towards stained glass ceilings, singing hymns in airy harmonies. Some monks even floated in silence for hours, achieving such spiritual stillness that pigeons began roosting on them. But amid this kaleidoscope of floating creativity, global scientists were quietly terrified. The planet had changed. Satellites monitored strange shifts. Gravitational pulses fluctuated, causing micro-earthquakes in one hemisphere and spontaneous cloud inversions in another. Ocean tides began misbehaving, rushing toward beaches, then sheepishly retreating before anyone noticed. Volcanoes grumbled without erupting. Whales sang differently. Something, no one knew what, had been broken or awakened. Theories multiplied. Some blamed the quantum thumper used in Operation Dropkick, claiming its ripple had disrupted the Higgs field. Others believed the sun's gravity had become disappointed in Earth and was slowly backing away. One man in Canada, entirely unaffiliated with science, swore that a large squirrel named Steve had stolen gravity and would not return it until humanity said please. Regardless of the cause, global leaders held emergency floating summits. They met in high-altitude orbit lounges made of salvaged blimps and strong opinions. Scientists presented data. Philosophers shrugged. Politicians blamed one another. Eventually, they reached one conclusion. Earth could no longer be trusted with just one gravity setting. So, with both desperation and flair, they did something spectacularly stupid. They built a dial. The gravitational modulation array, a skyscraper-sized machine perched atop Mount Kilimanjaro, gave humanity direct control over planetary gravity. The dial had 3 settings: standard, light, and party. Because democracy, this, of course, turned out to be a terrible idea. At first, it worked. Light mode became popular in cafes, making croissants appear delightfully floaty. Party mode was activated during parades, allowing dancers to moonbounce through city streets in sequined bliss. Gravity became trendy. Designers released gravity-curated outfits, and influencers filmed slow-motion videos of themselves crying at slightly reduced GS. But humans, being what they are, began arguing. Some demanded gravity-free Fridays. Others wanted a strict standard-only policy to keep soup safe. Nationalist groups emerged, calling for a return to traditional gravity values. Online debates raged. Conspiracy theorists claimed the dial wasn't real, that gravity had been faked since the moon landing. Others insisted gravity was flat. Then one day, a group of teenagers, possibly brilliant, definitely reckless, hacked the system. They turned the dial to max, and the world went down. Literally, the heaviest Tuesday in history began with a sound, like the entire planet being told to sit down hard. People slammed into sidewalks. Buildings creaked. Entire continents groaned. The Eiffel Tower leaned. Mars sighed in sympathy. No one could move. Yogurt exploded. Bathtubs cracked. Fashion took a hit as high heels became weapons. Those caught mid-jump were flattened into philosophical pancakes. And through it all, the gravitational modulation array sparked, flickered, then quietly shut off. The dial was stuck on max. The first global injury report under max gravity conditions took a full 36 hours to compile because every single data analyst was stuck to the floor, their keyboards painfully out of reach. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Chiropractors experienced a spiritual awakening, and yoga instructors, those brave, bendy souls, began whispering things like downward dog is now just dog. Around the world, humanity discovered just how fragile life was when gravity tried to hug you a little too hard. Forget flying. Now, getting out of bed required the strength of a bodybuilder and the willpower of a monk in a kettlebell cult. Entire cities fell into what became known as the Great Slump, a period of mass immobility where people just lay there, flattened, contemplating their life choices and how many ribs they could do without. And don't even talk about the toilets. No one talks about the toilets. Naturally, the blame game began. Nations pointed fingers. Politicians demanded answers. Meanwhile, the teens responsible for the gravitational prank released a statement via drone because walking was impossible, which read, "Our bad." It included a winking emoji, a link to their merch store, and a Spotify playlist titled Heavy Vibes Only. As the weight of the world quite literally crushed spirits, society was forced to innovate once again. Cities unveiled gravity-assist suits, essentially glorified bouncy castles worn as outerwear. Seniors were issued hover canes. Parents built sled-like carts to drag their children across sidewalks like sacks of sugar with opinions. Dogs were miserable, cats smug. Transportation became a nightmare. Cars were stuck. Buses groaned. Bicycles became abstract sculpture. Horses refused to move. Airlines replaced seats with floor mats and rebranded themselves as horizontal transport experiences. The only successful method of getting around was the lowly skateboard, which experienced a renaissance that made Tony Hawk look like a founding father. But even as society groaned under the weight of its own hubris, a plan emerged. A physicist in Slovenia, who hadn't moved in days and was now fused with her shag carpet, proposed an idea so bold, so magnificently idiotic, it just might work. Use synchronized interpretive dance, performed on a global network of trampolines, to nudge the gravitational field back into balance. Why trampolines? Because apparently, under max gravity, they were the only objects still capable of upward motion. The theory was that if enough people jumped in rhythm at key leyline intersections across the globe, it could create a pulse powerful enough to jostle the gravitational modulation array back into operational status. In other words, bounce the planet back to sanity. World leaders hesitated for about 4 seconds before unanimously agreeing, mainly because they hadn't moved in days and trampoline diplomacy sounded way more fun than being paperweights with opinions. So the world prepared. Trampolines were deployed en masse. Old Olympic trampolines were dragged out of storage. New ones were built using leftover stadium parts, bungee cords, and repurposed lingerie elastic. Thousands of volunteers signed up. The event was dubbed the Great Bounce. Naturally, the event was televised. Commentators breathlessly described teams of synchronized jumpers from 164 countries, each group trained in their national style of dance, bouncing with the hopes of all humanity literally on their backs. And then, they jumped. It was majestic. Brazilian samba met Japanese budo. Australian surfers bounced in wet suits alongside Kenyan marathoners leaping with quiet determination. Bollywood dancers collided midair with Scandinavian death metal fans who, surprisingly, moved with grace. And above it all, drones captured the breathtaking mosaic of color, movement, and desperate hope. At first, nothing. Then, a flicker. The gravitational modulation array groaned. A light blinked. Somewhere in the Alps, an old goat slipped slightly uphill. The earth shuddered, like a giant slowly waking up from a long, strange dream. And then, release. Not back to normal, mind you. That ship had sailed and crashed into a floating garden gnome in part 3. But the weight lessened. The crushing pressure eased. People could breathe again. Glasses lifted slightly off noses. Cats stopped pancaking. Someone sneezed and didn't need a chiropractor. Gravity stabilized. Sort of. Now it pulsed. A gentle wave, rising and falling every few hours. But it was manageable, predictable, rhythmic, like breathing, like a planet slowly learning to relax. And humanity, ever the oddball species, celebrated. New traditions formed. Daily gravity waves became cultural rituals. Some used them for meditation, others for competitive bouncing. A niche musical genre called grav hop emerged, composed entirely of beats synced to the gravitational rhythm. Kids born post-event were dubbed the pulselings. History books called it the bouncing. And as Earth spun gently through space, its gravity just a bit more alive, more expressive, humanity adapted once again. Because if there's one thing this strange species is good at, it's laughing, tumbling, and somehow landing, gracefully or not, on its feet. It began, as most interstellar encounters do, with a polite ping. One moment, The planet was still wobbling gently like a gelatin dessert on a washing machine. The next, every major satellite dish on Earth received the same concise message, transmitted in 4,732 known languages and one suspiciously similar to whale song. Hello, is your planet okay? The aliens had noticed. Apparently, when you pulse a planetary gravity field like a cosmic disco ball, it sends out ripples that say to the galaxy, "Hey, we don't know what we're doing, but we're doing it loud." Earth's gravitational spasms had been felt as far as the Arcturian sector, where several meditation planets had reported spiritual hiccups, and one species began spinning backwards out of existential sympathy. So, they came to investigate. Not in sleek, threatening saucers, mind you. No, these extraterrestrials arrived in something resembling a sentient beanbag chair that smelled faintly of lavender and moral superiority. They called themselves the Zorblaxians, and they were, by galactic standards, the equivalent of annoyed HOA inspectors for the cosmos. The Zorblaxians didn't invade. They gently docked, hovering over Geneva, or rather, over where Geneva used to be before the Great Float. They lowered a translator pod shaped like a worried teardrop. Out stepped three beings who looked like melted jellyfish dressed for an intergalactic TED Talk. Earth's welcome party was not ideal. A coalition of world leaders, suspended in low orbit by personal grav packs and duct tape, tried to look authoritative while rotating slowly and bumping into one another. The US president's hair kept floating into the Zorblaxian delegate's face, which it interpreted as a mating ritual and politely declined. The Zorblaxians got to the point. "Your gravity is broken," one said through the translator, which added a soft jazz backing track for comfort. "Yes," replied humanity, collectively. "We're concerned," another Zorblaxian said. "You're causing dimensional tremors. Mars has been complaining. Also, your moon is beginning to wobble flirtatiously." "Fair," said Earth. The aliens offered help. Not conquest, not enlightenment, just tech support. They referred to it as Stabilization Firmware 3.1. It came in a box the size of a soup can and required consent from at least 51% of the planet's sentient population. This, of course, sparked global debate. Some saw it as salvation. Others screamed about sovereignty and how no alien's gonna patch my planet without a proper QR code. A viral campaign began. #LetThemFixIt. TikTokers created gravity challenge dances in support. A rival campaign, #KeepTheWiggle, insisted the pulsating gravity was an expression of Earth's free will. Philosophers published treatises. Pigeons held symbolic mid-air protests. A lone billionaire tried to buy the Zorblaxians and was gently deflected into space. Eventually, Earth voted. The decision came down to a simple fact: neck pain. The planet was tired of floating into ceilings, slamming into floors, and losing cats to the attic. 74% of the population agreed. Gravity should be predictable again, even if slightly less sassy. The installation ceremony was broadcast globally. The Zorblaxians placed the firmware device into the Kilimanjaro array. It glowed. It hummed. It made a noise suspiciously like someone booting up an old Windows PC. And then, silence, followed by wait. Consistent, calm, deeply reassuring wait. People stood upright without swaying. Chairs behaved. Water flowed downward like it remembered who it was. Balloons rose again, not in rebellion, but in celebration. The Zorblaxians offered parting advice. Do not adjust gravity manually. Again, then they floated off, mumbling something about humans being adorable but exhausting, and left Earth to enjoy its recalibrated physics. And in that moment, Earth felt stable, but also nostalgic. Because in losing the chaos, it also lost a kind of magic. A shared absurdity. A planetary inside joke. Gravity was back. But something else lingered. An itch, a whisper in the bones, a sense that maybe, just maybe, reality could be bent again. Carefully, artfully, joyfully. Because once you've played trampoline with the universe, it's hard to stop bouncing entirely. It began, predictably, with boredom. After the gravity drama was resolved and the aliens had drifted off into the cosmic sunset with a polite, "Do not contact us again unless it is an emergency or your moon explodes," Earth found itself unsettlingly balanced. It was like the morning after a wild party where the couch is back in place. The glitter is mostly vacuumed, and someone has made coffee, but no one can quite remember why they ever thought swinging from the ceiling fan was a good idea. Humans, being who they are, got itchy. It didn't take long before someone asked the question, so, if we broke and fixed gravity, could we maybe tinker with time? Now, this would normally be dismissed as lunacy, but lunacy had lost its sting in a post-bounce world. After all, this was a species that had danced on trampolines to reboot the planet. The bar for sanity was now subterranean. Thus began Project Rewind, funded by a coalition of physics students, nostalgic billionaires, and one very persuasive podcaster with a surprisingly large following in Antarctica. Project Rewind aimed to do the unthinkable: hack the timeline. Not full-on time travel, no DeLoreans, no butterfly effects, no awkward meetings with your parents as teenagers. Just tweaks, minor rewinds, little skips. The ability to undo a sneeze during a romantic confession, or replay your last 3 seconds of grace before falling down the stairs. The vision was modest: personalized DVR for life. The prototype was called the Tickle Clock. It resembled a smartwatch fused with a mood ring and a very nervous toaster. Wearers could rewind up to 7 seconds of their personal timeline with a double tap and a verbal command like "oops," "nope," or "that's not what I meant." A beta group of volunteers was selected. They were told, very clearly, not to overuse it. Naturally, within hours, they had abused it into oblivion. The first problem? Loop addicts. People who found a moment so perfect, a kiss, a punchline, a winning goal, that they played it on repeat for hours. Neighbors complained. Employers were furious. One man spent 6 days reliving the moment he perfectly parallel parked, refusing to move the car ever again. It was art, he said. The second issue? Temporal cowards. Individuals who undid every interaction that didn't go exactly as planned. Dates, interviews, jokes. The result? Entire days where people interacted without speaking, smiling, or risking anything. Life became a choose-your-own-adventure story where no one turned the page. But the real chaos began when tickle clocks began to desynchronize. See, they weren't just rewinding you. They were nudging the local timeline, subtly warping cause and effect in microbursts. At first, it was harmless. Your coffee spilled in reverse, your sneeze unsneezed. But when 2 tickle clock users tried to rewind the same conversation, each wanting different outcomes, time stuttered. Reality started glitching. Eggs uncracked themselves into chickens. Doorbells rang before fingers touched them. Emails were received before they were written. One woman gave birth in reverse, resulting in a very confused baby and an even more confused maternity ward. Traffic became impossible because green lights sometimes appeared for yesterday's drivers. The world, in short, began to skip like a scratched record on a DJ's worst night. Naturally, governments intervened, first with gentle guidance, then warnings, then emergency time police, dubbed the chrono cops, armed with anti-glitch batons and soothing voices trained to calm citizens out of loops. Tickle clocks were banned. Except, of course, they weren't, because humans are humans. Black market versions emerged with even longer rewinds. A cult in Norway began preaching the sacred truth that time was a social construct and Tuesdays were a government conspiracy. They declared Wednesdays null day and refused to participate in any form of linear existence. Meanwhile, a small group of rogue scientists tried to develop the ultimate fix, the chronostabilizer, a device designed to re-anchor time across the planet and return causality to its previously boring, logical state. It required one massive temporal burst, something akin to smacking the universe with a cosmic ruler and yelling "straighten up." To generate the energy, they planned a simultaneous global event, the Great Pause. The plan was simple. Every person on Earth, at the exact same moment, would stop moving for 3 full seconds. No motion, no blinking, no talking. A worldwide freeze frame, resetting the flow of time by sheer coordinated stillness. It worked about as well as a group project in high school. Some people misunderstood and froze for 30 minutes. Others kept moving but thought they were being still. One guy live-streamed the entire thing with commentary, technically invalidating the pause for his entire hemisphere. Cats, of course, did not participate, citing artistic differences. Despite the chaos, the brief global hiccup did something. Time didn't return to normal, but it stopped unraveling. Now, it flowed forward again, mostly, with a few quirks. Sometimes birthdays arrived twice. Occasionally, dinner happened before lunch. But broadly speaking, people could once again live their lives without hearing their own punchlines before telling the joke. And Earth, wobbly but wiser, moved on. Time had been stretched, bent, rewound, and rebooted. And yet here we were, still stubbornly existing, still making mistakes, still dancing just slightly out of sync. In the quiet that followed the temporal chaos, Earth exhaled. Or rather, it burped. Time was mostly flowing in the right direction again. Gravity had stabilized with only the occasional vertical hiccup, and the moon had stopped flirting with Jupiter. Humanity, battered but proud, limped towards something resembling normal. And then, the stars blinked. Not in the usual romantic, poetic twinkle-twinkle way, but all at once. A coordinated, deliberate flicker. Observatories across the globe reported the same anomaly. Constellations vanishing for a millisecond, then returning, only slightly out of place, as if the cosmos had sneezed and lost its spot in the script. Then came the thud. It wasn't audible, not in the usual sense. It was a presence, a sensation like someone knocking on your subconscious. All at once, people around the world stopped what they were doing and stared skyward. Even toddlers went quiet. Dogs howled in harmony. A man in Nebraska dropped his sandwich and said, without knowing why, something just woke up. The ancients had noticed. They weren't aliens, not exactly, nor gods, though many would later describe them that way. They were the original engineers, the universe's version of building inspectors. They hadn't visited this corner of the cosmos in eons, mostly because it was a quiet spiral tucked behind a gas cloud, populated by species that rarely lived long enough to cause trouble. But Earth had broken gravity and time, and briefly tried to install a DIY reset button into the space-time continuum using trampolines and wishful thinking. That got their attention. They arrived without ships, without warning, without ceremony. Just arrived. One moment, humanity was hosting its first mildly stable Tuesday in years. The next, towering beings stood at key gravitational points across the planet. Easter Island, the pyramids, the downtown parking lot of a Buffalo Wild Wings. They were impossible to describe. Parts geometry, parts emotion, parts extremely disappointed parent. They didn't speak with words. Instead, they communicated directly into the minds of every living being with a level of passive-aggressive clarity only matched by mothers at Thanksgiving. We left you alone for a few millennia. You bounced the planet. You bent time. You looped your birthdays. You sneezed a chicken back into an egg. What? The world answered in one unified voice. We were curious. There was a pause, an exasperated pause, a cosmic facepalm. Then, strangely, laughter. It began as a vibration, a low, resonant chuckle that shook mountain ranges and made whales dance. The ancients weren't angry. They were amused. Earth, in all its chaotic, caffeinated glory, had done what no other civilization dared. It played with the universe like it was a sandbox and accidentally rebuilt the castle upside down. Fine, they said. You want to tinker? Tinker responsibly. With that, they left a gift. Not a machine, not a superweapon, a manual. It appeared simultaneously in every library, phone, inbox, cereal box, and stubborn grandparents' flip phone. A 90,000-page document titled, So You Want to Redesign Reality, a Beginner's Guide. It came with footnotes, warnings, and several sections crossed out with the handwritten note. Absolutely not. Don't even think about it. Humanity devoured it. Within weeks, new academic fields emerged: functional physics, temporal interior design, casual ontology. People began experimenting, carefully this time. Cities floated again, but only on weekends. Rain was scheduled. Mondays were abolished in certain time zones. A bakery in Peru developed muffins that phased in and out of existence based on customer mood. An artist in Nigeria painted portraits that aged backward. Iceland legalized parallel timelines for marriage, so couples could try multiple outcomes without filing paperwork. The Swiss developed a national button to pause all clocks for naps. It was glorious. Of course, mistakes happened. A theme park in Florida accidentally duplicated a roller coaster rider who then sued himself for identity theft. A minor time zone collapse in Belgium caused several weeks to stack on top of each other like pancakes. But humanity adapted. Again, that's what it does. Eventually, life found a rhythm. A strange, bending, looping rhythm, but a rhythm nonetheless. People laughed again, fell in love in slow motion, wrote books that began with the ending and finished in the prologue. They looked at the stars, not with fear, but with gratitude. Earth had changed. It wasn't the same planet that once spun in quiet ignorance under a passive sun. It was now a world that had tripped over its own gravity, slipped through its own seconds, gotten scolded by ancient cosmic entities, and kept going, kept trying, kept daring. And perhaps that's what made it special. Not its intelligence, not its ambition, but its joyful refusal to sit still. So now, if you ever feel the ground shift beneath your feet, or your watch hiccup, or the stars wink at you a little too knowingly, don't panic. That's just Earth being Earth. Curious, chaotic, utterly unreasonable, and gloriously alive. This has been What If Horizons, where absurdity meets possibility, and we ask the universe the most dangerous question of all. What if?